At New Year's dinner, my sister smiled and said, "Your support now covers my kids and my household." Simple as that, like it was already decided. My dad backed her up, pointing to the door and saying, "If you disagree, you know where it is." I didn't argue, I didn't hesitate. I just stood up and said, "Perfect. I'm gone, and you can start paying your own mortgage." They laughed, thinking it was just another bluff. But the moment I walked out, everything they depended on started slipping away. And what they discovered later made them realize I was never the one who needed them. At 8:17 p.m. on New Year's Eve, I stood in my father's dining room in Sacramento, holding a plate of cold prime rib and a glass of cheap grocery store champagne, watching my life's work be carved up like a holiday roast. My sister was speaking to me as if she owned my bank account, her voice cutting through the festive noise with a chilling sense of entitlement. I am Deborah Anderson, a 34-year-old production engineer, but to the people in this room, I was never a person. I was a safety net. For over a decade, I had been the one they called when the world fell apart, the one who paid for the car batteries, the water heaters, and the school fees that always seemed to cost exactly 4 figures. Tonight, as the clock ticked toward a new year, I realized that my family didn't love me for who I was, but for what I could provide. The table was suffocatingly crowded. My father sat at the head, radiating a quiet authority that he had never quite earned, but always demanded. Beside him was Vanessa, my sister, the golden child who never had to ask for anything because it was always given. Her husband, Brent, sat next to her, chewing his food with a detached indifference, acting as if the financial life raft I provided didn't involve him at all. Their 2 children were busy throwing dinner rolls at each other, a chaotic display that the adults dismissed as high energy rather than a lack of discipline. My status as the adopted daughter was the unspoken guest at every meal, a shadow that stretched across the table. I was the child they had taken in out of charity, while Vanessa was the real daughter, the blood relation, the one for whom the entire world was expected to tilt. I had arrived earlier that evening carrying a lemon tart and 2 expensive bottles of wine, along with an envelope that felt heavier than lead. It contained the January mortgage transfer for my father's house. He had texted me that morning, a brief, clinical message: "Dad needs your help covering the gap again, just until the bonuses hit." He had been talking about those mythical bonuses for 2 years. I was already covering a portion of their utilities every month and had stepped in more times than I could count to pay for my father's medication copays. In October, I had covered Vanessa's oldest son's after-school program. In November, I had written a check for $2,286 to a plumber because the family home mattered to all of us. By December, I had sent another $900 toward the mortgage because my father claimed the foreclosure notices were becoming dramatic. My brain, wired for engineering and precision, couldn't stop the internal ledger from running. Mortgage help in December, $900. Plumber, $2,286. Soccer fees for my nephew, $340. Groceries Vanessa forgot to budget for, $212.48. Amazon orders for household basics sent to my father's address, $187.13. I knew every cent because I kept the receipts in a digital folder on my phone simply labeled family. It was a record of my attempts to buy my way into a sense of belonging that was constantly moved just out of my reach. The room was loud, filled with the clatter of silverware and the high-pitched squeals of children. Vanessa's youngest had a smear of ketchup on his forehead that no one bothered to wipe away. Brent was on his 2nd beer and his 5th unsolicited opinion on the economy. My father was drifting into one of his sentimental moods, the kind that usually preceded a request for more money. Then, the atmosphere shifted. Vanessa set her fork down with a deliberate click and smiled at me. It was a sharp, predatory smile that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. She looked around the table and said, "We should just say it clearly for the new year." The room went silent. Vanessa continued, her voice steady and devoid of shame. She said, "Your support now covers my kids and my household, Deborah." Simple as that. For a heartbeat, I thought I must have misheard her. The words were so blunt, so stripped of the usual pretenses of borrowing or help, that they sounded surreal. I looked at Brent, expecting some flicker of embarrassment, but he just nodded once, as if she had successfully summarized the minutes of a corporate board meeting. Then I looked at my father. He didn't even blink. He lifted his glass, took a slow sip of his drink, and looked me dead in the eye. He told me that if I disagreed, the door was right there. My mouth went dry, and my heart hammered against my ribs. In the silence that followed, my mind began to count meaningless things to keep from shattering. There were 4 adults at the table, 2 children in booster seats, 1 wall clock on the far wall ticking far too loudly, and there was 1 mortgage payment scheduled to leave my bank account at the stroke of midnight. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, looking satisfied. She told me that I didn't have kids, I didn't have a husband, and I made engineer money. "This helps all of us," she added. That phrase, "all of us," was the foundation of every trap they had ever set for me. I looked down the long table. Brent still wouldn't meet my gaze. My father had that hard, practical expression he wore whenever he was about to justify an act of cruelty. My stepmother, Diane, continued cutting her meat with surgical precision, acting as if she weren't witnessing the total collapse of basic human decency. Only Vanessa's daughter, Emma, seemed to feel the tension, glancing at me before staring down at her plate. Even a child could tell when a line had been crossed so violently it could never be uncrossed. I slowly set my napkin down on the table. "Perfect," I said. Vanessa blinked, her confidence wavering for just a second. I told her that if it was that simple, then I was gone, and they could start paying their own mortgage. The room went still. My father let out a short, ugly laugh. He told me not to be dramatic. I stood up, feeling a strange, cold calm wash over me. I wasn't being dramatic, I informed them. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, opened my banking app, and navigated to the scheduled payments. While they watched in stunned silence, I tapped the screen. The January mortgage transfer was canceled at exactly 8:21 p.m. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a grand, emotional speech. I simply picked up my coat, my car keys, and the lemon tart I had brought for dessert. "You just confused access to me with ownership of me," I said quietly. Then I turned and walked out of the house. I didn't scream until I was safely inside my car. I sat there for a long time, both hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I opened the folder on my phone that they didn't know existed. There was something else they were going to find out later, something much larger than a single mortgage payment, and it was going to cost them everything. I had been adopted when I was 3 years old. That is a sentence that lands differently depending on the listener. Kind people see it as a beautiful story of a second chance. Curious people ask about my real parents. But in my family, my adoption was a tool. It was never spoken of in a way that I could openly complain about without sounding oversensitive, but it was the atmosphere I lived in. My father loved to tell people that I was the blessing they chose, while Vanessa was the daughter they were born with. It sounded sweet until I grew up and realized that being chosen meant I was expected to be eternally indebted. I learned very early that gratitude was the only currency I was allowed to use. Vanessa was given grace for her mistakes, but I was given expectations. If she forgot to pay a bill, she was overwhelmed and needed support. If I hesitated to hand over money, I was being selfish and cold. I worked as a production engineer at a food packaging plant outside the city. It was a job defined by long hours, emergency maintenance calls, and solving complex problems under pressure. It paid well, but only because I kept my head down and worked harder than anyone else. I had bought a small condo when I was 29, a modest 2-bedroom place with a view of a parking lot. It was the only thing in the world that was truly mine, and my father had resented that independence from the start. The pattern of exploitation had become undeniable 5 years ago when Brent lost his job. My father had called me, sounding desperate, claiming Vanessa just needed 6 weeks of help. 6 weeks turned into 8 months. I paid for daycare, rent gaps, and groceries while Brent was between opportunities. Vanessa had cried in my kitchen once, telling me that if she failed, our father would never let her hear the end of it. I had helped her because I was still trying to earn a place in the family that was never actually for sale. The second major incident happened when my father asked me to co-sign a truck refinance for Brent. When I said no, the fallout was immediate. My father went silent for days before calling me a disappointment. Vanessa had texted me, reminding me that I was in a better position than they were. That phrase became a family slogan, a justification for every withdrawal they made from my life. Then, last spring, the mask slipped completely. Diane had accidentally sent a screenshot to me that was meant for Vanessa. It was a group chat I wasn't part of. My father had written that I would cover a certain expense because I hated conflict more than I hated paying. Vanessa had replied with a laughing emoji, telling him to just frame it as helping the house. Helping the house was the code they used for manipulation. It wasn't debt or pressure, it was help. It wasn't entitlement, it was practicality. My father loved to keep things smooth, which really meant keeping me quiet while they bled me dry. A scene in our family was simply the act of naming what was happening while it was happening. I had swallowed my pride and my anger for years because I thought the situation was temporary. But as I sat in my car on New Year's Eve, looking at the house I had been subsidizing, I realized the only thing that was temporary was my patience. I was done being the family's silent benefactor. They wanted a life without me. They were about to find out exactly how much that life cost. The way my family introduced me was always a subtle indicator of my utility. Diane once presented me to a neighbor as our adopted daughter, Deborah the engineer, as if my professional title was the only reason I was worth mentioning at all. Every road led back to me. I paid because I was capable, then I paid because I already had a history of doing so, and finally, I paid because stopping felt like an act of cruelty. A year before that disastrous New Year's dinner, my father called me over to help with some paperwork regarding the house. I found him with envelopes scattered across the table, wearing that wounded, practical expression he reserved for the moments he wanted cash without having to say the word. He claimed he needed help with a temporary problem. When I asked why Vanessa wasn't contributing, he answered without a hint of shame, "She has mouths to feed." It was as if my life didn't count. I may not have had children, but I had a mortgage, retirement goals, and the simple right not to be the family's personal ATM just because I was financially stable. The danger of being the calm, reliable one is that people eventually treat your restraint like a natural resource, unlimited, renewable, and there for the taking. By December, I had begun documenting everything in silence. I kept screenshots of texts, Zelle confirmations, and photos of the final warning envelopes my father would accidentally leave on the table for me to find. I wasn't working toward a master plan yet. I was simply tired enough to become precise. I assumed the worst-case scenario was that I would cut them off, and they would call me selfish for a few months. I had no idea that a much deeper layer of manipulation existed beneath the surface, and it had my name written all over it. The morning after I walked out of New Year's Eve, I woke up to 14 missed messages. My father told me to call him. Vanessa accused me of embarrassing her in front of her children. Diane insisted that everything could be fixed if I just calmed down, and Brent told me I was overreacting. My father's final text was the most telling. "Mortgage is due on the 3rd. Don't be childish." I made a cup of coffee and sent exactly one reply. "I am no longer paying any expenses for your house or Vanessa's household. Do not ask again." His response came in under a minute. "After everything we did for you." There it was, the adoption debt finally unwrapped and weaponized. The first wave was pure guilt. I ignored the calls and the voicemails. Diane left messages in that soft, dangerous tone she used to manipulate situations. She claimed nobody expected me to owe them forever, but that my father was old-fashioned and saw family as a collective. It was a collective that only ever seemed to flow in one direction. Vanessa tried to backtrack, claiming she only meant support in a general sense. I sent her back the exact quote she had texted me earlier that evening: "Your support covers my kids and my household now." She didn't reply. Then Brent called from an unknown number. He told me I had blown things out of proportion. When I pointed out that his wife had literally claimed I covered their household, there was a long silence before he tried to sound reasonable, saying, "You know how families talk." The second wave began a week later and was far more practical. I received an email from my bank asking me to confirm a home equity inquiry for my father's address, an inquiry I never submitted. I called the fraud department immediately. Someone had started an online application using my name, date of birth, income bracket, and partial social security number. It wasn't successful because they hadn't provided the necessary documentation, which the bank had requested be sent to my father's email address. My hands went cold. I called my father and asked if he had used my information for a loan. He laughed, his classic tell, and told me not to accuse him of crimes just because I was in a mood. Then he admitted he was just seeing what options existed, claiming it was all family property. That sentence changed something permanent in me. When I asked who gave him my employment details, he went silent before telling me that if I had helped like I was supposed to, none of this would have been necessary. I stopped arguing and started documenting for real. I froze my credit, filed a police information report, and initiated a formal fraud report. I printed 18 months of transfer history, exported every text, and organized the timeline with engineering precision. I created folders for mortgage help, household support, and unauthorized inquiries. While researching the property records for my father's parcel, I found the ultimate shock. 2 years prior, a transfer on death deed had been filed and then replaced. My name had been on the original list. Vanessa's was on the update. Mine was gone. Worse than that was a private family reimbursement agreement attached to a county correction notice. I had never seen or signed it. The document claimed that my ongoing financial contributions were voluntary occupancy-related obligations. I hadn't lived in that house since I was 26, yet they were framing my gifts and loans as legal obligations tied to the property. I spent my lunch break at the county recorder's office getting copies. There was no forged signature, which was almost more insulting. My father had simply signed his own internal paper trail, as if his word could rewrite reality. He had built a fictional story where I contributed because I had agreed to, and where Vanessa's needs were anticipated under prior discussions. One line made me laugh out loud in the empty parking lot. Adoptive daughter Deborah Anderson acknowledged moral commitment to household continuity. There were no initials and no signature from me, just my father's fiction written in legal-sounding English. They thought they had emotional leverage over me, but what they actually had was a paper trail, and paper trails work both ways. On January 14th, I hired Elena Ruiz, a sharp civil attorney who wore navy suits and didn't waste words. She reviewed my folder in 20 minutes. She asked if I had lived in the house during those payments or if I had authorized the credit inquiry. When I told her no, she looked up from the files with a grim expression. Elena leaned back in her chair, the fluorescent lights of her office reflecting off her glasses as she asked the final, clarifying question. Did you ever, at any point, sign a document acknowledging a legal or moral obligation to support this household? My answer was a firm, immediate no. She nodded once, a sharp and professional gesture. Good, she said. Then we stop letting them narrate your life. Within a week, Elena's office dispatched a three-pronged legal attack, a formal cease and desist, a demand for the preservation of all relevant documents, and a notice officially disputing any claim that my past payments were anything other than voluntary gifts. Then, she gave me one task to handle personally, a single, controlled statement to set the boundary in stone. On a Monday morning at 9:30 a.m., I sent a message to the family group chat, effective immediately: do not use my name, income, credit, or prior financial support in connection with your mortgage, household, or any application for funds. My phone erupted. My father called in under 10 seconds. I declined it. Vanessa, Diane, and Brent followed in quick succession. I ignored them all. That evening, the peace of my condo was shattered by a heavy, furious pounding on the door. It was my father. "Deborah, open this door," he bellowed through the wood. "You do not send lawyers after family." I didn't open up. Instead, I stood inside with my phone in hand, watching him through the camera I'd recently installed. I told him once to leave. When he pounded again, calling me an ungrateful little, he was cut short by the arrival of a patrol car. I had called the non-emergency line the moment he refused to leave. The officer spoke to us separately. My father, true to form, softened his voice, playing the role of the wounded patriarch. But the officer asked the only question that mattered: did she authorize the use of her information? My father tried to provide context, but the officer cut him off. Yes or no? My father finally muttered, "Not exactly." That was the moment the charade ended. The officer issued a trespass warning so clearly that even my father couldn't pretend this was just a family misunderstanding. He left, pale and livid. 2 days later, Vanessa tried a different brand of guilt, sending a photo of her children with the caption, "Hope this was worth hurting them over." I forwarded it to Elena without a word of my own. I was busy changing every point of access in my life: emergency contacts, recovery emails, beneficiary forms, and door codes. Through the bank's complaint process, Elena subpoenaed records proving the loan inquiry came from my father's home IP address, using salary details he'd lifted from a document I'd once shared with Diane. The tone changed instantly. The lectures about family vanished, replaced by desperate pleas to resolve this privately. But too far is just what people say when consequences finally reach their front door. By March, my life was smaller, quieter, and infinitely better. I was no longer funding other people's chaos. I bought a new couch, not as a symbol, but because I finally prioritized my own comfort. My friend Tasha summed it up best over Thai food: "They treated you like a wallet with feelings, then got shocked when the wallet hired counsel." In April, I was promoted to senior production engineer. I celebrated in a silence that felt expensive and earned. My father tried one last move, mailing a $200 check for my birthday with a note about things getting out of hand. I mailed it back through my lawyer. Vanessa sent more photos, talking about misunderstandings. I replied one last time: "I'm not available for financial access disguised as family," and blocked her. There was no dramatic courtroom finale, just the cold finality of legal admissions. My father had to sign a formal withdrawal of any claimed reliance on my support. I didn't want revenge. I wanted the truth pinned down. I was never obligated. I was never their backup plan. Being adopted didn't make me an open line of credit. They learned that I hadn't just left, I had kept the receipts. The people who benefit from your silence will always call your boundaries cruel. Set them anyway. Access to me is not a right they own.